The panda bear is quite a unique animal. We seem to have a special place for it in our hearts, especially compared to other bears, for obvious reasons. However, it only really survives in one country. It needs constant care and assistance to, well, survive, but it brings in a lot of money and employs a lot of people. However, realistically, it serves no purpose, and arguably, if it wasn't for our weird affinity for its cute behavior, it would be extinct by now. You see, banks and financial institutions in general hold a special place in our economy, and not just in Canada but around the world. During the 2009 financial crisis, the world saw how a single industry can single-handedly take down an entire economy, if not the economic stability of the entire world. Unlike enormous multinational corporations like Walmart or ExxonMobil, the failure of these companies would hardly shake the economies of the world. However, even the smallest of the big six banks, like National Bank, going under, would set off a chain reaction and lead to a financial crisis which would threaten the stability of our entire economy. The top 6 banks in Canada control 86% of our banking and financial services in our country. That includes deposits, investments, loans, mortgages, and commercial banking. And the failure of any one of these banks would mean companies can't move money, employees don't get paid, and people cannot buy food. And this is where things tend to get scary. Now, due to Canada's population, we never necessarily had a lot of banks, unlike in the US where thousands of regional, local, and semi-national banks existed alongside the big large banks. And over the past 100 years, these small regional banks have all consolidated to form the large mega banks we see today. However, in Canada, many of the new entrants into the market have slowly been bought up and consolidated by the Big Six, with ING Direct being acquired by Scotiabank and PC Financial, which was already operated by CIBC and renamed to Simply after being acquired, and Canadian Tire Bank, which was bought in part by Scotiabank, and Hollis Canadian Bank, which is also controlled by Scotiabank, and Zag Bank bought out by Desjardins Group. And if we go back 50 years, some famous examples like the Bank of Toronto merging with the Dominion Bank to form Toronto Dominion Bank, and merging again in 2000 with Canada Trust to form the namesake of its operating branches, TD Canada Trust. Today, it's currently our largest bank in Canada by deposits. So it's safe to say that the history of Canadian banks is a history of one merger after another. Canadian banks have always been purchasing banks in the US and especially in Latin America and the Caribbean for years. Some recent examples are CIBC purchasing Private Bank Corp in the US for $4.5 billion, and RBC, which bought out the famous bank City National Corp, which serves many A-list celebrities, and not to mention TD, which bought out MBNA, the credit card issuer. And in fact, TD has been acquiring an entire list of credit card businesses, buying up the rights to retail stores like Nordstrom, Target, and even buying up Bank of America's credit card industry in Canada. The question is, how do Canadian banks afford to not only buy up so many banks and financial assets? And also, why does it happen the other way around? Why do we never see a US bank buying up a smaller Canadian bank? And why aren't there any larger international banks operating in Canada? Well, here's the problem. These banks can only operate as Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 banks. Schedule 1 being classified as a domestic Canadian bank, like the Big Six. Schedule 2 and 3 are classifications of foreign banks that are not majority owned by Canadians, either in shares or outright. The problem is this limits the true fully fledged banks like Chase Bank from operating in Canada. And the only way around this is if JP Morgan Chase opened up a completely separate entity that solely operated in Canada. This is why HSBC can have branches in Canada, accept deposits and issue credit cards, being a British bank, is because they operate as a separate entity in Canada, with their own separate stock listing on the TSX, an entirely separate board of directors and head office here in Canada, putting a high bar for any banks hoping to enter the Canadian market. Although patriotic, we are still perfectly happy with shopping at American retailers, importing foreign cars, and especially overpaying for F-35 fighter jets, despite the fact that Canadian banks are allowed to operate openly in the Caribbean and buy up banks in Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, Costa Rica, essentially half of Latin America and all of the Caribbean. Scotiabank owning so many foreign subsidies that they proudly build themselves Canada's most international bank, having branches in Europe, Latin America, and even India, This Canadian-centric protection of our financial industry from outside influences of big competitors like Chase, Wells Fargo, or even Deutsche Bank from setting up a branch in a vacant plaza near you is this exact restriction. Few companies are willing to swallow the huge expense of essentially creating an entirely separate business just to operate in Canada. However, we've seen this issue before. Cronyism masquerading as patriotism. In 2013, when the federal government began auctioning off a portion of the cell phone spectrum to new entrants, therefore allowing Verizon to enter Canada by purchasing the rights to the cell phone band, Bell, TELUS, Rogers quickly banded together to urge Canadians that allowing Verizon to enter Canada and compete was the second coming of the War of 1812, and our sovereignty was on the line, further cementing the concept that being Canadian meant maintaining semi-monopolies and paying much more for everything than our friends in Europe and the United States, despite living in an ever more interconnected and economically open global economy. And this is exactly where the problem is. Banks in Canada are like a nestled little panda bear, protected from any actual competition and are allowed to run rampant, overcharging Canadians by billions while racking up fortunes from the fees they charge us to buy up banks overseas and in the US to further bolster control and grip over our economy, growing so large that they are deemed too big to fail, which essentially gives them a free license to print money, as no one, politicians, regulators, or even the consumer, challenge their profit-making operation, as you would in turn be challenging a force that employs vast swaths of the population, controls an obscene amount of our GDP, and controls the net worth and stability of Canadians everywhere. Make no mistake, Canadians are now the most indebted citizens on earth. And it's no secret that the government bends over backwards to ensure banks can loan out trillions while assuming little risk. We continue to subsidize their business model so they can grow ever larger. And what is our argument for this continuing force that leads to further concentrations of wealth and power into the hands of a few companies that essentially move digits around on a screen?